Well, you ready to dive into the grapes and the styles and the soils and terroirs of Alsace?
Yeah, sure. I just want to have a little note about soil because I don't really want to talk too much about it because I don't think it's super helpful
Okay.
for ordinary consumers who are beginners on the region to try to understand the role of the different soils on the grape varieties. But I do think it's important to at least mention because one other thing that's really, really special about Alsace is that by many, you can make a case that it's the most geologically complex wine region on Earth. It has 13 different geological formations under the Vosges Mountains that show up in different ways. And that's pretty exciting when you start diving into the wines because you get a lot of different expressions of these grape varieties that are completely dependent on the soil that they come from. However, I want to caution people against trying to buy wines based on soil type. Yeah, and the Alsatian winemakers are so proud of this trait and attribute that I've seen a lot of wines labeled with geological terms.
Really?
So like this wine is called granite, and you're like, oh, I'm in the mood for granite tonight. It's maybe not like the most helpful term because you kind of think, well, what do you expect from a Riesling from granite? However, I do think it's important for people to know that this complex geology plays into the diversity of Alsatian wine. You have a very long mountain range that has diversity because of daylight hours from north to south because it's such a long region. So that's one attribute. You have a lot of microclimates from these side valleys that come out of the Vosges Mountains. But then there's this plate tectonics equation underneath the surface that just makes it a real Rubik's Cube. And I think if you get into the Grand Cru wines, that's where you're going to start seeing the soil play in a different way. And I think the way that you notice that is on the palate. You're not going to get signatures of aromas nearly as much with soil, but it has to do with the acidity and how quickly it crosses your palate. It has to do with kind of the texture of the wine. It has to do with the finish. And the reason soil is so important in all this is because different soils will tell the roots to do different things. If it's an area that doesn't retain a lot of water, which is the case with the Riesling that we're tasting here in a moment, the roots are going to have to go very, very deep in order to find water. And that makes the vines work harder. And that makes oftentimes the grapes a little bit more expressive and aromatic. Sometimes the acidity is a little bit more sharp, a little bit more acidic, a little bit more kind of quick footed, as I like to kind of call it. I always like to talk about acidity in momentum terms. So the soil does play an important part of all that.
Well,
And that's a real
you
important part of
you answered
Alsatian
my
wine.
question on soil. That's all I wanted it to be, was just to kind of talk about the importance of the soil and that it is just different, not to necessarily dive
Yeah,
into, the granite versus
sure.
limestone or whatever it might be, but just that it's
Yeah.
different throughout the area, and it affects the wine in different ways. To your point.
Yeah, and it's some vineyards will be mostly granite, some will have a lot of shale, some will be sandstone, some will be limestone, some will be clay, and then there's like a whole lot that are like a mix of all of that. And they're from different geologic eras as well, so that's why geologists would codify them as differently. The one that's really interesting, and I love telling these little stories, and this is just kind of a anecdote about what makes this region interesting. There's one Grand Cru vineyard that stands out above all the others in terms of being just the weirdest and strangest and most eccentric, and that's the Grand Cru Rangon de Tan, which is way in the south part of Alsace, and it's on volcanic soil. So it's kind of a rarity in Alsace to have volcanic soil. So that's one trait that's unique. But it's also a very, very steep vineyard that is over a river. And that river provides humidity that permeates a certain section of this Grand Cru vineyard to allow for what is really a rarity in the world, which is a volcanic wine with noble rot.
Oh, wow.
And so Domaine Zind Humbrecht works in this vineyard, and they produce the most incredible Pinot Gris and Riesling from this vineyard that is completely different from one vintage to the next. The Grand Cru Rangon de Tan and Olivier Humbrecht, if you ever get a chance to talk to him, he's a master of wine, incredibly intelligent winemaker, and he really loves to just let this vineyard tell him how the wine should be made each year. So I've had versions of it that are sweet, and it's the most rockin' sweet wine you've ever had because it has that volcanic tone of acidity, the kind of the smoky quality to it, but it's also a sweet wine because of the noble rot. So you've got the noble rot sauterine kind of thing happening to it. There's just so many of these little stories in Alsace that are just totally fascinating and beguiling. So, soil does play a part in the identity of a lot of these wines.